After his mother's funeral, relatives kicked the poor orphan out. Years later, he surprised everyone. This story begins with the life of a little boy who had just had his world turned upside down. Stephen was just 10 years old when he buried his mother. She had been a loving and caring woman who had fought cancer till the end. As her casket was lowered into the ground, the poor boy shed all the tears he had been holding all day. He could not imagine his life without his beautiful mother, who has always been there for him and had loved him until her last breath. When the funeral service was over, the young boy sat on the front steps of his mother's house, overlooking her vegetable garden. He recalled the long hours she would spend working on it. She would trim the leaves and pull out the weeds all day under the sun. Even when she became too weak to do it, Stephen would take her to the garden and tend to the vegetables as best he could. "This is my place, Stephen, but it doesn't have to be yours. There are unlimited possibilities in the big city. Don't forget that," his mother would always tell him. She never wanted him to be trapped in the small town he grew up in. She had dreams of her beautiful son making it in the big city, earning a lot of money. It was her dying wish. What the poor woman could not have anticipated before her sad death was what would happen to her son when she was gone. Because he was still a minor, Stephen either had to live with relatives or be put into foster care. Stephen's aunt and her 3 boys moved into his mother's house that same day. They were loud and rowdy and weren't sensitive to Stephen's recent loss. Soon after, the family completely took over the house. Stephen was moved out of his bedroom, the room he had grown up in, with his favorite toys and games, his storybooks, and even the knitted quilt from his mom. His auntie moved him into the sofa bed in the living room and moved her sons into Stephen's room because of its size. The poor Stephen felt hurt all over again, especially when he saw that his cousins were destroying all his stuff. He tried stopping them, but every time he tried, they would bully him, and since he was outnumbered, he never tried to fight them. They even threatened to tear up the quilt his dead mother had knitted for him. Stephen spent most nights crying himself to sleep and wishing his mother was still alive. It seemed like his life would only get worse from here. Even his aunt, his mother's sister, was a horrible woman. She always made comments about Stephen and how ungrateful he was that she was sacrificing so much to take care of him. His aunt would often ignore Stephen's pleas for her to try and stop her sons from destroying his stuff. On one particular day, their ambitious boys were playing outside and they got into Stephen's mom's vegetable garden, which Stephen had been taking care of since she passed. The other boys pulled out the plants and scattered the soil everywhere. "Please stop them," Stephen cried to his aunt. This was one of the last things that connected him to his mom, and they were destroying it. "Why don't you just hush? You're so ungrateful. I have packed up my life to come here and take care of you. Stephen, all you do is cry and complain. If you don't like it, get out," his aunt yelled at him. Her eyes were wide in anger. That night, as Stephen lay down on the uncomfortable sofa, his aunt's words replayed in his head. Fine, that's exactly what he was going to do. Stephen packed his backpack with his quilted blanket, some underwear, and a couple of shoes and socks. He snuck out while it was still dark. He got on his bike that he had received for his 10th birthday and began to pedal as fast as he could. With every mile away from his house, he began to breathe better. Tears poured from his eyes as he pedaled and pedaled. His mom had always wanted him to go to the big city, and that was exactly what he was going to do. Sure, it was earlier than she had probably expected, but Stephen could not spend another minute living in the house with people who hated him. The young boy wasn't entirely sure of his navigation, but he followed the back roads and his eyes were fixed on the tall buildings on the horizon that were all indicators he was close to the city. The boy was determined and didn't stop pedaling all night long until the bright lights from the city were now close distance. The sun was starting to rise when Stephen stumbled upon an old man wearing dirty and torn clothes. It was clear he was homeless. Stephen saw the man was eating a steaming hot pastry and his mouth watered. He hadn't realized how hungry he was, and he hadn't packed any food with him, nor did he have any money. The old man saw the boy staring and offered him the bag of pastry. Stephen nodded eagerly and grabbed the food from the old man. The old man watched in amusement as Stephen devoured the entire thing in one bite. Just then, the two started talking. Stephen told the old man what had happened and why he had run away. The old man introduced himself as Harry and shook his head disapprovingly. He didn't think it was a good idea for such a young boy to run away. He didn't say this to the poor boy. Stephen stifled a yawn as he spoke to Harry. "I can see you're tired. Haven't had much sleep, I suppose," Harry said as both of them walked down an alleyway. Stephen shook his head. He hadn't even stopped once as he pedaled to the city. The old man showed him into an abandoned apartment building. It was run down but habitable. There was a dusty living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen. Harry allowed the poor boy, whose eyes were now filled with exhaustion, to have the bed. Just before Stephen drifted to sleep, Harry, the old man, asked him about his aunt. Wouldn't she report him missing? "Trust me, she wouldn't care that I'm gone," he said sadly before drifting off to sleep. The boy was woken by the smell of pasta. His mouth watered even more as he followed the smell into the tiny kitchen. There, he saw Harry stirring some sauce into a little pot. He grinned at his plate and presented it in front of him. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the boy's stomach. He smiled up at the old man. He had been taken care of more in the few hours than in the months he had spent with his aunt. The two then sat at the rickety dining table to eat their dinner. Harry watched as the little boy devoured his food, and he was reminded of a time when he was that young and had been recently made homeless. He knew all too well about the life of someone who grew up on the streets and how difficult it is to survive. He would do anything he could to make sure that little Stephen survived. Harry informed Stephen to be careful of the area in which they lived. It was not the safest area, as the neighborhood was run by the notorious biker gang. Harry admitted that the leader of the gang was kind to him and gave him food from time to time, but it didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. Harry made Stephen promise not to get recruited to join the gang, as they were always looking for young boys to join. Stephen listened intently to the man and agreed to be safe and stay away from the bikers. After dinner, Harry brought out some old books he had packed away. The pages were yellow and worn, and the covers were dusty and almost completely withered away. Still, Harry had kept these books with him since his younger days. He knew the importance of being literate and educated in today's world and would make sure that Stephen was knowledgeable and educated as he could be with the limited resources. So the old man opened up the dusty book and began to read to Stephen. It was advanced for a 10-year-old, but Stephen didn't mind. Soon, this became a ritual every night after dinner. Harry and Stephen would read a book together, and Harry would explain words and concepts that the boy could not understand. It was a perfect routine for about 5 months. The two bonded and became best friends, never leaving each other's side, apart from when Harry went out to source for food or clothes. Stephen was instructed to stay inside. However, on this day, Stephen was extremely bored of looking at the dirty, peeled wallpaper in his room and decided he would play outside. He had seen other kids his age play in the alley, but had never been brave enough to venture alone. But that day he did. He put on his worn shoes and walked into the alley. It was damp and muddy and smelled bad, but the boy didn't mind. He just wanted to play. The other kids on the street were very friendly and invited them to join their game of kicking a soccer ball around. When Stephen had the ball, he kicked it and it went flying high until it hit a shiny chrome motorcycle. Stephen's eyes grew wide as he heard the other boys gasp. When heavy footsteps approached, the kids ran away immediately. Stephen was left standing there, face to face with a tall man who wore a leather jacket and had a beard. He looked scary and had tattoos on his fingers. The poor boy was shaking and couldn't move as the scary man got closer. "Be careful where you kick that, okay?" the man said. His voice was far from menacing. It almost sounded friendly. Stephen apologized, his voice trembling like he was about to cry. The man put a comforting hand around Stephen and told him it was all right. He then invited him to take a closer look at the motorcycle. It was a Harley Davidson with a chrome exterior, looked shiny and out of place in the dingy alleyway. The man introduced himself as Bucket. No first name or last name, just Bucket. Stephen wondered if that was a nickname or if his real name really was Bucket, but he was too afraid to ask. Bucket went into detail about his motorcycle and how cool it was. The boy listened in awe, as he had never seen anything so cool before. Just then, Harry, the old man, came back from his day of looking for food and clothes. He had bags in his hands and shuffled along the cold stone alley. When he saw the young boy talking to the leader of the biker gang, he became worried. He said hello to them both and asked Stephen to take the bags into the house, leaving him alone with Bucket. "That's a runaway?" Bucket asked Harry. "Yes, he is, and I'm looking after him. Listen, no gangster for this kid, okay? He's smart, he's got a future," Harry said. He might have been old, but he was not intimidated. Bucket looked genuinely surprised. He assured Harry that he had no intention of getting Stephen involved in any gang activities. He was just looking out for him. Soon after that, Stephen started spending his afternoons with Bucket and his crew. They ran a car and bike repair shop, and Stephen sat and watched as the men worked. On days when Bucket thought things might get a bit rough, he would send Stephen home to try and keep him safe. Otherwise, the boy learned a lot from the crew and picked up skills very quickly. A few more months went by. He was 11 years old now and was working at the repair shop. He knew all about fixing a leaking valve, changing tires, and other car and motorcycle related things. The crew were very impressed by how quickly he adapted, and they all kept reminding him how great he was going to be one day. Many years had passed, and Stephen was now a young man in his early 20s. He was right. His aunt never looked for him or filed a missing persons report. When he was 18, Stephen decided to take the exam so he could gain a high school diploma. He was now working full-time at the repair shop and had found a tiny apartment for him and Harry to live. The rent was affordable, and his wages were able to cover it, as well as food for the two of them. They were by no means rich, but they at least were no longer homeless. One fateful day, just like many years ago, Stephen was least expecting it. Harry passed away in his sleep. Stephen was distraught. It felt like he was losing his mother all over again. The only person who cared about him was gone, and he was all alone in this world again. After a quiet funeral for Harry, Bucket drove up to his apartment. The two exchanged hugs, and Bucket offered his condolences. "I'm sorry about old Harry. He was a special one. He looked out for you and wanted you to make something of yourself. I'm giving you my motorcycle and also the repair shop," Bucket said to Stephen, who was astonished. Bucket explained that he was retiring and moving back to take care of his mother. It was such a good thing to come out of this day. Stephen knew that Harry and his mom were watching over him. One day, Stephen was taking his motorcycle out for a ride when he came across a traffic pileup on a bridge. Many people had gotten out of their cars and were peering over the bridge into the water. He jumped off his bike and saw a car that had crashed the barricades and was teetering over the bridge. The driver was still in the car. The young man looked around and didn't see anyone in a hurry to help the situation, so he took off his leather jacket and wrapped it around his fist. He then used his fist to break open the glass and pull the driver out quickly. Just then, the car tumbled into the water far below. The driver he had just saved was shaking uncontrollably. Stephen tried to calm her down, but she was in tears now. "I need to get out of here. I think I'm going to have a panic attack," she said with a trembling voice. The young man offered her a second helmet and tapped the seat of his motorcycle, offering her a ride. She took the helmet eagerly, strapped it on, and squeezed Stephen tight as they sped away from the accident. Stephen drove her home. At this point, she had calmed down a little bit and was able to offer her name. "My name is Jess. Thanks for saving my life." The two walked outside of the steps of her house. It was a big house with a big driveway and multiple cars parked. Just then, the garage door lifted, revealing two more cars inside. An older man walked out. He was wearing a business suit and had 3 cell phones in his hands. He looked shocked when he saw the look on the girl's face, and even more shocked when he saw Stephen, with his leather jacket and dirty fingers from the repair shop. "Jessica?" That was all the man said, and then the girl ran towards the man who was her father. She cried as she recounted how she lost control of the car on the bridge and almost died. She told her father that it was Stephen who saved her life and barely rescued her from an imminent death. The man was overcome with emotions. He shook Stephen's dirty hands and went in to hug him also, thanking him for saving his daughter's life. The man cancelled all his meetings for the rest of the day and invited Stephen into his home for lunch. At lunch, Stephen and the man talked, and Stephen told the man his story, from when he ran away from home and how he now owned a repair shop. Jessica's father was so impressed with Stephen's courage and resilience. It turned out that the man owned a car brand and was looking to invest in a car maintenance and repair business and go into partnership, so that anyone who bought his car would have a direct link to the repair shop for maintenance. He proposed this idea to Stephen, and the young man was overwhelmed. It sounded like a great idea. This would mean a lot of money for the repair shop. The two men talked more business, and by the end of lunch, a deal was struck. A year later, Stephen locked up his repair shop for the evening. The new look was classy and clean. He had expanded his business, not only by size, but by numbers across the city. He had trained the crew to know more about luxury cars, and because of this, the amount of money he earned and paid his crew was 5 times more than before. The business deal with Jessica's father and his car company had been a success. Stephen got into his car where his fiancée, Jessica, was waiting for him. He had proposed to her a few months ago and she had said yes. Stephen started his car and looked at his fingers. Although he no longer went under the hood of cars and worked on oil changes, sometimes he still liked to have a hands-on role with his crew and teammates, so occasionally his hands would be dirty. Jessica pulled out some wipes and handed it to him with a sigh. The two drove for a while till they left the city. Jessica asked Stephen where they were going. Stephen wanted to show Jessica his childhood home. Sometime later, they arrived at the familiar porch. Stephen had not been here since he ran away many years ago. He looked around. The house was in bad shape. The paint was peeling, the wood was getting old, and the grass was overgrown. He turned and looked at his mother's vegetable garden. To his surprise, it was pristine. The soil had been neatly turned and some carrots were beginning to sprout. Stephen took Jessica's hand as both of them went up the creaky stairs. As he rang the doorbell, he realized that he had no hate or anger in him. He had let everything go many years ago. An old woman shuffled to the front door. She looked tired. It was his aunt. "Stephen," she said, and tears filled her eyes. She opened the door and began to apologize for everything. She welcomed him and Jessica inside and told them that her boys had gone down the wrong path and had been involved in a robbery and were currently in prison. She blamed herself for not being a good mother to them and allowing them to get away with terrible things. Stephen asked her why she never reported him missing. Her eyes were teary again and her fingers trembled. I didn't want you to be found. I'm so sorry. 3 boys were a lot for me. I couldn't handle another." Stephen sighed deeply as he stared at the frail woman in front of him. He closed his eyes and remembered the faces of the people who had loved him. He remembered his mother's warm smile. He remembered Harry's voice when he read to him, and Bucket's impressed laugh when he watched him work on cars at such a young age. Those were the people who cared for him, who found him when he was lost, and he would forever be grateful to them.